He walked into the most famous gunfight in American history carrying a weapon that most people completely misidentified. Not a pistol, not a rifle, a shotgun. A 10-gauge Wells Fargo coach gun, to be specific. And in a fight that lasted barely 30 seconds, that weapon did something no revolver in the Old West ever could. But here's what almost nobody tells you. It is not just the gun itself that is extraordinary, it is the combination of the man, the disease slowly killing him, the friendship that put the weapon in his hands, and the physics of what that 10-gauge actually does to a human body at 6 feet. Doc Holliday was dying long before anyone pointed a gun at him. Tuberculosis was consuming his lungs one hemorrhage at a time. And that dying man, somewhere around 130 pounds on a good day, walked into a gunfight in a narrow lot in Tombstone, Arizona, and became the most lethal person present. This is the story of Doc Holliday's shotgun. How it got into his hands, what it was capable of, what it did on October 26, 1881, and why the history of that weapon has been misunderstood and mythologized for over 140 years. The man before the myth. John Henry Holliday was born on August 14, 1851 in Griffin, Georgia. His father was a pharmacist and a veteran of the Mexican-American War. His mother was the center of John Henry's early world. She taught him piano, instilled a love of literature, and raised him in the traditions of the antebellum South. She also died of tuberculosis when John Henry was 15 years old. That is not a footnote. That is the first domino. He watched his mother waste away from the same disease that would later claim him. The coughing, the blood, the slow suffocation. And somewhere in that grief, John Henry Holliday decided he was going to be a dentist, not a gambler, not a gunfighter, a dentist. He graduated from the Pennsylvania College of Dental Surgery in 1872 with a record that suggested a long and respectable career. He set up practice in Atlanta. He had a future. Then the coughing started. The diagnosis came in 1873. Tuberculosis, the same disease that killed his mother. The doctors told him the humid Georgia air was accelerating the progression and that he needed to go west. The dry climate of the southwestern territories was the best medicine anyone could offer in 1873, which tells you a great deal about medicine in 1873. He moved to Dallas, Texas, and tried to continue practicing dentistry. But tuberculosis is not subtle. His coughing fits and increasingly gaunt frame frightened patients out of the chair. Nobody wants a man who looks like death working inside their mouth. So Doc Holliday became a gambler. He was extraordinarily good at it. He had a mathematical mind sharpened by years of precise technical training and the emotional control that comes from having already accepted your own death. When you are dying anyway, a bad hand of cards is not exactly terrifying. He drifted west through the gambling towns of Texas and Kansas, Fort Griffin, Dodge City. He developed a reputation not just as a skilled gambler, but as someone genuinely dangerous in the way that only men with nothing left to lose can be. Other men at the table had families and futures. Doc had neither, and everyone around him sensed it. In Dodge City in 1878, he met Wyatt Earp. Doc intervened in a situation where Wyatt was badly outnumbered, and that act of loyalty created one of the most consequential friendships in frontier history. Wyatt Earp said years later that Doc was the most skillful gambler and the most dangerous man with a gun he had ever seen. Notice what that says. Not the fastest draw, the most dangerous. The most dangerous man in a fight is the one fully committed to a lethal outcome and impossible to deter. Doc had been threatened with death by his own body for years. Another man pointing a gun at him was a comparatively manageable problem. By 1880, both men had drifted to Tombstone, Arizona territory, a silver boomtown that attracted every variety of fortune seeker, criminal, and entrepreneur the frontier had to offer. It also had the Clanton and McClory families, a network of ranchers and rustlers with very specific problems with the Earp brothers. The pressure had been building for months. Threats, confrontations, accusations of murder, and rustling. By October 1881, both sides understood that something final was coming, and Doc Holliday was going to be part of it. The weapon. Let us talk about the gun. Most people who know anything about the OK Corral picture revolvers, the Colt single-action army, the Peacemaker, the iconic six-shooter of the American West, and revolvers were absolutely present. But the weapon that settled the fight in its opening seconds was not a revolver. It was a 10-gauge Wells Fargo coach gun. A coach gun is a double-barreled shotgun with a shortened barrel, typically cut to between 18 and 24 inches. Wells Fargo had their stagecoach guards carry these weapons because the shortened barrel handled easily in a coach box, on horseback, or in close-quarters confrontations involving silver and cash shipments. These were not hunting guns. They were commercial tools designed for one purpose: stopping people quickly at close range. The specific shotgun Doc carried on October 26th was not his. It was given to him by Virgil Earp just before the fight. When the Earp party moved down Fremont Street toward the vacant lot where the Clantons and McClorys were waiting, Virgil handed Doc the shotgun and took Doc's walking cane in exchange. Let that exchange sit with you. A town marshal handing a shotgun to a dying dentist-turned-gambler, accepting a walking cane as the trade. That is the entire Doc Holliday story in a single gesture. Trust, necessity, friendship, and the strange mathematics of who you want next to you when things go badly wrong. Now, about the 10-gauge specifically, most people are familiar with the 12-gauge. The 10-gauge is larger. Lower gauge number means larger bore. The system dates to an era when gauge was calculated by how many round lead balls of the bore diameter equaled 1 pound of lead. 10 balls to the pound means a bigger ball, a bigger bore, and a heavier payload. A 10-gauge bore measures approximately 0.775 inches in diameter versus a 12-gauge at roughly 0.729 inches. A standard 10-gauge defensive load in the 1880s launched between 1¼ and 1½ ounces of lead shot, heavier than a comparable 12-gauge load, with a heavier black powder charge driving it. A shotgun does not fire a single projectile. It fires a cloud of pellets. In a combat load of the 1880s, buckshot was the standard choice. A 10-gauge load carried somewhere between 9 and 12 individual projectiles, each one approximately .33 caliber, traveling together down the barrel, then spreading as they cover distance. At 6 feet, the spread of a 10-gauge buckshot pattern from a cylinder bore coach gun would have been roughly 3 to 4 inches, not scattered across the body. A tight cluster about the size of a fist. But within that cluster, 9 to 12 lead balls arriving simultaneously. There is no armor, there is no margin. There is no meaningful chance of survival with 1,881 medical care. People ask why revolvers were the prestige weapon of the frontier when shotguns were clearly more destructive at close range. The answer is practicality. A revolver sits on your hip, draws in a fraction of a second, and gives you 6 precise shots before reloading. A shotgun is slow to reload and impractical for everyday carry. But in a planned confrontation, close range, multiple opponents, 18-foot alley, there is a reason Virgil Earp handed Doc the shotgun. Virgil was a professional. He understood exactly what was coming down that street. The fight. The gunfight at the OK Corral did not actually take place at the OK Corral. The confrontation happened in a narrow vacant lot on Fremont Street, adjacent to C.S. Fly's photography studio near the rear entrance to the OK Corral. The lot was approximately 18 feet wide. 18 feet. About the length of a mid-sized car and a half. Not an open field. A tight, constrained space between 2 buildings. In that lot, on October 26, 1881, at approximately 3 o'clock in the afternoon, 9 men came together, and roughly 30 shots were fired in approximately 30 seconds. The Earp side, Virgil Earp, Wyatt Earp, Morgan Earp, and Doc Holliday. Opposing them, Ike Clanton, Billy Clanton, Tom McClory, Frank McClory, and Billy Claiborne. Ike Clanton and Billy Claiborne fled without firing. That left 3 effective opponents: Tom McClory, Frank McClory, and Billy Clanton. The sequence of the first few seconds has been argued for over a century. Witnesses saw what they were positioned to see or what they needed to have seen for subsequent legal purposes. The broad shape is consistent. Virgil called for them to throw up their hands and surrender their weapons, and the shooting started almost immediately. Both sides claimed the other fired first. What is not in dispute is what Doc Holliday did with the shotgun. He fired both barrels at Tom McClory. McClory was on the right flank, partially positioned behind a horse. Whether he was armed at that precise moment has been argued since the afternoon it happened. What the evidence agrees on is the result. The shotgun blast caught Tom McClory in the right side of his chest and torso. At that range, with a 10-gauge buckshot load, the wound was catastrophic. McClory staggered back, made it approximately a block down Fremont Street, and collapsed. He was dead within minutes. In those same first moments, Wyatt Earp shot Frank McClory with a revolver. Frank was hit but not immediately incapacitated. He continued fighting, returned fire, wounding Doc Holliday, before being finished by shots from Morgan and Wyatt. That contrast tells you everything about the difference between a revolver wound and a shotgun wound at close range. Billy Clanton was shot multiple times and died later that afternoon, reportedly still trying to cock his revolver with a hand that could barely function. The fight was over in 30 seconds. 3 men were dead. Virgil Earp was hit in the leg. Morgan was shot through both shoulders. Doc Holliday was wounded. Wyatt Earp, one of the most famous pieces of poker luck on record, was not hit. All 4 Earp-side participants were arrested on murder charges. The hearing before Justice of the Peace Wells Spicer lasted a month and ultimately cleared all 4 men. The legal exoneration did not end the conflict. Within weeks, Virgil was ambushed and permanently lost the use of his left arm. In March of 1882, Morgan was assassinated while playing billiards, shot through a glass door. After that, Wyatt and Doc rode out on the vendetta ride. But the 30 seconds on Fremont Street are what history remembers. And the first 2 of those 30 seconds belong to Doc Holliday and the 10-gauge. The physics of devastation. Let us examine the ballistics directly, because one of the persistent reasons Doc Holliday's shotgun gets underestimated is that people apply modern assumptions to 1880s weapons. Black powder burns differently from the smokeless powder that replaced it by the 1890s. The pressure curve inside the barrel is different. The wound characteristics are different. And the sensory impact on everyone nearby is different in ways that matter tactically. A 10-gauge black powder buckshot load of the 1880s produced muzzle energy in the range of 1,500 to 2,000 foot-pounds. A modern .44 Magnum, one of the more powerful handgun cartridges available, produces roughly 900 to 100 foot-pounds. The 10-gauge was not simply a more powerful revolver, it was a categorically different weapon in terms of terminal effect. Raw energy numbers still do not capture the full picture. That energy is distributed across 9 to 12 individual projectiles arriving simultaneously. The tissue disruption from multiple simultaneous impacts is different in kind from any single bullet wound. A revolver hits one specific point. A buckshot load turns a concentrated area into a wound that could not be survived with 1881 medicine. Black powder also produces a dense white smoke when it burns. In an 18-foot lot between 2 buildings, firing both barrels in rapid succession generated a smoke cloud and concussive blast that disrupted every person present. In a 30-second fight where situational awareness determines everything, that disruption mattered. Doc Holliday's opening action created a fog of confusion that worked in his side's favor before anyone else had processed what was happening. The physical challenge of firing that weapon in Doc's condition deserves acknowledgement. By October 1881, he had been living with tuberculosis for approximately 8 years. He weighed around 130 pounds. His lung capacity was compromised. He carried a cane because he needed it. A 10-gauge double-barreled shotgun weighed 8 to 9 pounds unloaded. The recoil from a full black powder load is significant even for a healthy adult. Firing both barrels in rapid succession from a body in Doc's condition required physical determination the mythology tends to minimize. He was not superhuman. He was a sick man who showed up when it counted. That is more impressive than the legend. Why the shotgun gets overlooked. There is a cultural reason why Doc Holliday's shotgun does not occupy the same space in the popular imagination as his presumed pistol skills. The American mythology of the gunfighter is built entirely around the pistol duel. 2 men facing each other in the street, the quickest draw walking away. This image is so deeply embedded in the cultural narrative that it tends to reshape actual history to fit the template rather than the other way around. The shotgun does not fit that image. A shotgun is not a dueling weapon. It does not require precision aiming or a refined fast draw. It is effective precisely because it does not demand exceptional skill. Pointed at close range and the physics do most of the work. But that practicality was exactly why it was the right weapon for Fremont Street. The fight was not a duel. It was a chaotic, close-range engagement in a confined space against multiple opponents. In that environment, the shotgun was the superior choice. and Virgil Earp understood that when he made the exchange. The films have not helped. Almost every cinematic portrayal reaches its iconic moments through pistol work. Kirk Douglas in 1957, Victor Mature in 1946, Dennis Quaid in 1994, Val Kilmer in Tombstone in 1993. Kilmer's Doc is extraordinary, the cup-spinning scene, the delivery of "I'm your Huckleberry," all of it exceptional work. But even Tombstone builds its emotional climax around pistols. The shotgun gets a moment. It does not get the weight it deserves because the Western genre reserves that weight for the pistol and always has. There is also a simpler reason. Doc only had the shotgun for a few minutes. Virgil assigned it to him for this specific situation. He used it. It worked. Both barrels were empty, and the fight was over before reloading was possible. The weapon that defined the most famous moment of Doc Holliday's life was not even his gun. It was borrowed. A loan from a friend that lasted about 5 minutes and changed history. After Tombstone. After the OK Corral and the Vendetta ride, the political situation in Arizona had become untenable for both men. The legal machinery was moving against them, and the enemies they had accumulated were substantial. Both left Arizona in 1882 and never returned. Wyatt Earp lived until 1929, dying in Los Angeles at 80 years old. In his final years, he worked with writers to shape the legacy of the OK Corral, not always with complete honesty, but always with one consistent thread. Doc Holliday was the most trusted friend he ever had. Doc continued gambling through Colorado, had a few more brushes with the law, nothing that rivaled Tombstone. In 1887, he moved to Glenwood Springs. The hot springs there had a therapeutic reputation, and at that point, Doc was willing to try anything. The tuberculosis that had been working on him for 14 years was finally winning. On November 8, 1887, at approximately 10 in the morning, John Henry Holliday died in his room at the Glenwood Springs Hotel. He was 36 years old. The story that his last words were, "This is funny," spoken while looking at his bare feet, has been repeated so often that separating fact from embellishment is impossible now. But it fits. The frontier expected Doc Holliday to deliver his victory, shot down in a barroom or alley. Lying quietly in a hotel bed was, from his perspective, genuinely uncertain. He had been making dark jokes about his own life for years. Finding irony in the ending would have been entirely characteristic. He was buried in Linwood Cemetery in Glenwood Springs. The current headstone reads, "He died in bed," which manages to be both a statement of fact and a punchline. The precise location of his remains within the cemetery is not definitively established, because the original grave markers were largely lost over the following decades. Somehow appropriate. Definitive answers were never really Doc Holliday's specialty. What the shotgun tells us. There is a broader argument to make about that shotgun, one that goes beyond gauge measurements and ballistic tables. The moment when Virgil Earp handed Doc the 10-gauge coach gun is, in miniature, the entire story of the American frontier. A lawman making a clear-eyed decision under extreme pressure, choosing the most effective tool and putting it in the hands of the most effective person available, regardless of whether that person fits any conventional definition of law enforcement. Doc Holliday was not a formal deputy. He was a gambler with tuberculosis who happened to be Wyatt Earp's most trusted friend. Virgil looked at what was coming and made a judgment call. Give Doc the shotgun. That judgment was correct. 30 seconds proved it. The weapon itself is not romantic. Wells Fargo coach gun is a commercial tool manufactured to a functional standard. Wells Fargo issued dozens of identical guns to guards across the southwestern territories. They were workhorses, not showpieces. That a dying Georgia dentist carried one of those workhorses into the most famous gunfight in American history and used it more decisively than anyone present used a revolver is one of those historical ironies that resist easy interpretation. Tuberculosis sent Doc Holliday west. Gambling gave him a living. Friendship gave him a purpose, and a borrowed shotgun gave him a legacy. The ballistics are not complicated. At close range, with buckshot, a 10-gauge double-barreled shotgun is one of the most devastating weapons a person could carry in 1881. The physics are not subtle. The outcome on Fremont Street was not surprising to anyone who understood what that weapon does at 6 feet. But the history is more interesting than the physics. The history is about a man who had every reason to stop, every medical warrant for waiting out his remaining time somewhere quiet. Instead, right up until he could no longer get out of bed, he kept showing up. He kept playing cards. He kept standing next to Wyatt Earp when it mattered. Wyatt Earp outlived the OK Corral by nearly 50 years. In his old age was when he talked about Doc Holliday, the affection was unmistakable, even filtered through all the myth-making. "I never had a better friend than Doc Holliday," Earp said, across multiple decades. "I don't know that I deserved his friendship, but I had it." Without that friendship, there is no Tombstone. Without Tombstone, there is no OK Corral. Without the OK Corral, the 10-gauge Wells Fargo coach gun is just another piece of hardware in a storeroom. And John Henry Holliday is just another consumptive gambler who died young in the territorial West. Instead, because of one friendship and one borrowed weapon and 30 seconds in an alley, the name Doc Holliday has outlasted nearly everything else from that era. The shotgun was more devastating than people think. The ballistics confirm it. The historical record confirms it. 30 seconds on Fremont Street confirm it most definitively. But the real devastation was quieter. It was a dying man who kept showing up, kept standing next to his friend, kept making the choice to be present when the moment arrived. The 10-gauge just made the moment count. Doc Holliday died in a hotel bed in Colorado, which surprised everyone who thought they knew how that story had to end. The shotgun he carried on October 26, 1881, is part of the historical record. The fight it helped settle lasted 30 seconds. The legend it contributed to has lasted over 140 years and shows no sign of fading. History tends to remember weapons through the names of the men who carried them. But sometimes the more interesting story runs the other way. Sometimes the weapon tells you something about the man that his name alone cannot fully capture. A 10-gauge Wells Fargo coach gun, borrowed from a lawman by a dying gambler in a narrow alley in Tombstone, Arizona. 2 barrels, both fired, both effective. Doc Holliday carried plenty of revolvers across the years. History remembers him for this one. If you want to go deeper on the weapons and the men of the Old West, subscribe. This history deserves more than 30 seconds. Cinematic opening, teaser, hook. It is October 26, 1881. 18 feet of dirt alley, 9 armed men. A dying man raises a shotgun he does not own. He weighs 130 pounds. His lungs are half destroyed. His hands should be shaking. They are not. He pulls both triggers. The black powder detonates with a concussion that rattles the buildings on either side. White smoke swallows the alley whole. And somewhere inside that cloud, a man who was standing 1 second ago is no longer standing. 30 seconds from now, 3 men will be dead. The most famous gunfight in American history will be over, and nobody will be talking about the right weapon for the next 140 years. If you want to hear uncensored, too hot for YouTube stories, check out my Patreon in the description. Tell us where you were watching from and subscribe.